Be talking to you today about some aspects of interprofessional education, and in particular, I'm going to talk a little bit about role clarity and sexual assault. So let me just start by talking about interprofessional competencies. We all, as health and social care workers, we all work, when we get out in the real world, in teams. All kinds of different teams. But nurses don't just work with nurses, and social service workers don't just work with social service workers, and police and paramedics don't work in isolation. We all work together. We haven't done a great job of educating people together, and yet we expect them to be able to work together when they get out in the real world. So there's been a lot of talk about this, and some talk about what are the competencies that make people better able to be good interprofessional workers, or another name for it is team workers. And there are 6 competencies that have been identified here in Canada. This has been discussed internationally, but as here in Canada and even locally, we've developed 6 competencies that we're going to be focusing on. I'll list them, and each week we'll talk about a different one in a little bit more detail. So they are role clarification, being able to say, what do I do, what do you do? Team functioning, being able to each make your contribution to a situation that requires more than one professional. Collaborative leadership, being able to sometimes share leadership. For example, there are many situations where police and paramedics might arrive, and a police if you have an injured person, a paramedic thinks, okay, that I take the lead in this, I'm in charge. But if there's a situation that the police officer thinks might be unsafe, maybe a perpetrator might still be in the premises, the police officer might feel the need to take the leadership role. That's when there needs to be collaborative leadership, where they each take a leadership role in their area of expertise, and they may end up having to discuss when people will do what in order to make things go have the best possible outcome for the client. Next one, interprofessional communication. So being able to communicate well with other people. And it's funny, as professionals, we each have our different jargon and our different lingo. So for example, I was just in a meeting. When I use the acronym IPE, I'm talking about interprofessional education. So IP to me is interprofessional. I was in a meeting with somebody with a slightly different background. They were talking about IP. They were coming from more of a legal angle on this issue. IP to them meant intellectual property, but it took me a long time into the conversation before I recognized we were both calling something IP, and yet we meant something completely different. So we have to be careful with interprofessional communication, because each different discipline has its own language, and we can confuse each other. The next one is interprofessional conflict resolution, and that conflict is inevitable when you work in teams. People think it's a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. It's an inevitable thing. A bad thing is when it becomes negative or nasty. But having it can just be a different perspective, and acknowledging you have a different perspective and finding, how are we going to each be able to do what we think needs to be done in this situation. So conflict can actually be a really positive thing. And the last one is family client-centered approach. This is one that's going to be interesting when we get to it, because every profession sees this quite differently. Some people, this is the whole focus of their practice, and for some people, like police or even paramedics, this might be some foreign language. So we're going to talk about how each of the different professions kind of focuses on this differently. So I'm going to talk just a little bit in a little bit more detail about role clarification, and because that's what we're going to talk about today. So in order to be able to work with other professionals from other backgrounds, we need to be able to know our role and be able to say it clearly and be able to understand the role of other people. We need to be able to understand that people come with different perspectives, and to sort of be able to value that and recognize that. I'm going to give you an example of a situation where I was speaking to a nurse who works in one of the major hospitals here in town, and her specialty is working with sexual assault victims. Every time a sexual assault victim comes in, she gets called in. And she spoke a little bit about how your role is so different in these situations. So there's a police officer whose role is going to be to catch the person who did this. That's an important role, and we all want that to happen. And yet the nurse's role in that situation is quite different. And so their priorities, because of their roles are so different, their priorities are going to be different. And they're each going to need to clarify, okay, what do I need to do? What am I here for? And to be able to figure out how can you get your job done as well as I get my job done, and each sort of feel that we get the outcomes that we want. This particular nurse talked about often there being conflict because it's not that she didn't think it was important to catch the perpetrator, but the emotional well-being of the client sometimes felt more paramount to her in a particular moment, whereas gathering evidence might have seemed more paramount to a police officer in a moment. So sometimes there would be a little bit of conflict in those situations. So role clarification is really important. And never assume that the people that you're working with know what you're talking about. I'll let you read some of the other aspects of this, of role clarification on your own. When it comes to sexual assault, every professional has a different background in terms of what they're taught about working with sexual assault victims. Some people may have virtually no background. It may be that in some programs, even though just about everyone that's involved in this course, there's a high likelihood you will work with a sexual assault victim at some point. What you've been taught about it is quite different, and it would be really helpful for you to share that with each other. Some people, the focus might be on the initial treatment and transport to hospital. Some people, it might be gathering verbal evidence. Some people might be gathering the physical evidence. Other professions will be supporting the victim or finding resources for the victim after the fact. So everybody's, what we've learned and what the focus is, the role is going to be very different for the different professions, and that's something that's going to be really important to talk about in your small groups. Last thing I want to talk about was some myths about sexual assault. And I might post the article that I got these myths from. And it's important to talk about because when there are myths out there about sexual assault, they actually can taint the way even the language we use when we talk to a sexual assault victim. So this is just something important for maybe in small groups again to talk about. One of them is that the sexual assault victim in some way deserves it. And when I say that, it's not because necessarily one thinks the person's a bad person, but a common thing to say is, well, why would you wear such a short skirt? Why would you go there at night alone? And I think part of the reason why there's this myth about people deserve it is it makes us feel safer, because if I don't deserve it, then I won't be sexually assaulted. That it's an active impulse, that you just wrong place at the wrong time, completely an active impulse. Actually, sometimes people think things through carefully. Some perpetrators think things through carefully in advance, and often they do look for someone who appears in some way to be vulnerable. Another myth is that it's always a stranger who is the attacker, and in fact, more often than not, it isn't a stranger. Another myth is that there must be significant injury. If there isn't significant injury, it probably wasn't actually a sexual assault. And again, more often than not, there isn't significant injury, but that doesn't mean that sexual assault hasn't happened. Again, another one is that it could have been prevented if the individual who was sexually assaulted just fought back. That's a very common myth, that if you fight back, then you can't be sexually assaulted, and it is a myth. For a number of reasons. Some people freeze and are paralyzed. Some people are threatened and feel that, or whether they're threatened or not threatened, they feel that if they fight back, maybe they'll be killed or maybe they'll be horribly harmed. Another myth is that the best recovery is not to talk about it, sort of to move on and put it behind you. And in fact, people that have been sexually assaulted need to talk about it. They need to process it. They need to cry the tears over it that deserve to be cried. So they usually need to find someone that they can talk to. Sometimes that's a professional, sometimes it's not, but very often a professional is really helpful in that situation. And the last one, of course, that fits with many of these is it wouldn't happen to me. And the real truth is that all kinds of people are sexually assaulted. Babies, women in their 90s, men in their 90s, all backgrounds, all walks of life. So that sense that it's only a certain type of people that could be sexually assaulted, again, that absolutely isn't true. It's important to think about some of these myths because they really affect, sometimes they can affect how we are when we work with people that have been sexually assaulted. So I hope you guys take the time to discuss what you have learned in your programs and what your perspectives are on working with people from who have been sexually assaulted, and specifically what your role would be so that everyone can understand that. Thank you.